How's it going, guys? My name is Mike here and welcome back to another video. In today's video I'm going to be talking about a theory regarding Pokemon Generation 1 and Generation 2. So basically I was scrolling through Twitter and James Turner, an artist who works with the Pokemon company, released a screenshot or a scanned image of a book that has basically been written about Generation 1 Pokemon that were to be put into the games, but were never actually finalized and finished. So I'm going to basically talk about this and what this basically could mean, and I basically want to talk about the index numbers and missing no and the forms that these things should have been but aren't actually linked to. So let's just get straight into the video and I'll just talk about it more. Right, so as we can see here, we've got here James Turner's tweet, and essentially it says from the Satoshi Tajiri manga. So this is basically the little book that they've compiled, obviously the Pokemon company have compiled and given to employees, basically showing off different things to do with the start of Pokemon. Early designs of Pokemon, including ones that didn't make the cut. So if we look here, we can see there's obviously Diglett there, Tangler there, Blastoise, Voltorb, Rhydon, that sort of thing. And if we look at the bottom left of some of these, we can see that they have numbers. So that's 56, 59, 62, 65. Now note, these aren't Pokedex numbers. As we found out later, these aren't Pokedex numbers at all. These are index numbers, referring to a code number, basically in the order that they were created. And what it does is it just reassigns the index number to the Pokedex. And so we can see from this person, Torchickens, they've basically said, well, 59 is Diglett and 58 Seal, but it's not necessarily 100% the order of the Pokedex. We're going based on the idea that Rhydon is number 1 and that every Pokemon following it is just the order they were created in. So as we can see here, we've got 62, which is meant to be Missing No Ursaring. So it's basically saying that Missing No was a form, and the Pokemon it's meant to be when transferring from Generation 2 using the time capsule, it's meant to be Ursaring. So if you transferred, for example, the Ursaring, you'd obviously get Missing No. But this is saying that in that index position where Missing No is, it should be this design here, which obviously never got carried through. Now, the interesting thing about this is that there's quite a few of them. Obviously, we've got 56 up there. That looks like almost a pre-design for Xerneas, which is really weird because Xerneas is obviously a Gen 6 Pokemon. And we can see that it's meant to be Sneasel. So obviously, somehow, they've either redesigned it to be Sneasel or they've just completely got rid of this idea. They've done it with the several of them. So obviously we've got that one there. We've got number 62, which looks like a little crocodile sort of thing. We've also got the one in the bottom left, 67, which is kind of like 3 spikes. And then 68, which is like a torpedo shark. Now, the interesting thing is that they're not really looking like the Pokemons that they ended up being in Generation 2. For some reason, the index position matches those Pokemon. My theory is with this is that they basically designed these Pokemon that as they're intended to be in Generation 1, but they obviously never got finished and finalized, so therefore they scrapped them, and they basically started, shuffling around to design one for Generation 2. And for some reason, when you export from Generation 2 and import it into Generation 1, those specific Pokemon and forms go to that index number. We don't really know why, but I've looked into it, and we've got a index list right here, the same one that's in this tweet essentially. And what we can see here is that we've obviously got Rhydon's number 1. That was the first Pokemon ever created. It's an index number of 1 in the hexadecimal. So we can see there that we've basically got most of, the Kanto dex, apart from there's these gaps, like I've said before, Missing No. And obviously this is meant to be Scizor and Shuckle, and we assume, or we did assume anyway, that because we imported these into Generation 1 from Generation 2 time capsule, we can assume that that was Shuckle, for example. But when we look obviously back on this tweet here, and this image, we can obviously see that, for example, 56 is meant to be a Sneasel. That clearly doesn't look like a Sneasel, even if it was a Generation 1 sprite. So there's the idea and the theory that obviously data's changed, and so they're given the index numbers, and it's obviously shuffled it around for some reason when it gets time capsuled. However, we can see that in this one, obviously, that was never meant to be Sneasel, that was meant to be something else, which means that it's been dropped. Now, if we go to Bulbapedia's thing about Missing No, we can see here that the yellow one appears through Mew glitch, I'm just going to use yellow as an example because of the new games being obviously a yellow reboot. So we can obviously see that it's a dual type normal, and it appears using the palette of Pikachu, which is quite interesting, compared to the red-blue form, which uses weird shapes and weird blocks essentially. But what we can see here is obviously it says here, the time capsule exploit if traded Pokemon is these Pokemon here. And I'm going to go back to a really old Smogon post from 2010, so that's 8 years ago, from a guy called Zog. And essentially he spoke to GameFreak about this a long time ago and asked specifically about them. So apparently there's meant to be 190 Pokemon in Generation 1, but obviously in Generation 2 they added the ones that they've removed, so 39 of those were removed from Generation 1, and they obviously put them into Generation 2. But it's not that simple, like I explained earlier, because they obviously have the forms that aren't meant to be the forms. So they've got the ones that looks like Xerneas, but isn't actually going to end up a Sneasel. So they must have just ditched it. And we know the order of these first 190 Pokemon. What led him to form this theory, and what led me to form my theory with the new information we've got, is the index list and missing no, again here. So if we look, there's obviously evidence that Rhydon was the first Pokemon designed. And obviously, if we order them in the index list like I explained earlier, the list obviously has gaps where missing no goes. And after 190, it loses its index number and becomes the Gen 2 Pokedex, which is really an interesting point, because technically, we trade back Sneasel, for example. Sneasel then becomes an index number in the Generation 1 Pokedex. However, it's a Generation 2 Pokemon. So that means that it's got an index number for Generation 2, therefore it shouldn't have one for 1. And this is what we didn't know. We didn't have a gap to fill. So we assumed that it was just Sneasel in Generation 1, and they obviously re-indexed it for Generation 2. The thing is with data is the problem is you can't have two resources taking up two different indexes. You can't have the same sprite taking up two different index numbers. So Sneasel couldn't have taken up this index number in Generation 1, whether we wanted it to or not. Obviously, when the data's been transferred over with Time Capsule, it's become muddled and changed to be that of the form that we see in the concept art. Except obviously GameFreak didn't want those Pokemon there, so never actually put them in the resources, which then led to obviously the missing no. Now this is really interesting, as this person, Zog, asked GameFreak about it. This was in 2010. He asked Shigeki Morimoto, the guy who made Mew, and basically he said, so in Red and Green were there exactly 190 Pokemon? The translator relays to Morimoto, and he jumps out of his chair enthusiastically and says, we decided to save the rest of the designs for later. And the guy said, so example, Ho-Oh was made for Red and Green first, since it was in the first episode of the anime. We've always wondered this. Why has a Ho-Oh appeared in the sky in the first episode of the anime, but we never saw anything of it in red, green, blue, and yellow? And this obviously explains it. So he hears Ho-Oh and looks confused, and when the translator says the rest of it, he says the rest of it to him, he remains the same. And the translator says, no, not Ho-Oh, he wasn't made earlier. Now, this Zog guy obviously thinks, well, this is a bit weird because it's number 49 in the list on the index, so it must have been made for Generation 1. But the interesting thing is that I think that, and he thinks that, there was obviously a translation error in the fact that they think, GameFreak thought, oh, well, we didn't make it for Generation 1. It was obviously scrapped. So I think that was kind of a translation issue. But here, obviously, they didn't want to keep Ho-Oh in red and green, but they made it at the time red and green was a thing. Another interesting thing is Satoshi Iwata. He was the one guy who tried making the two regions together, Johto and Kanto. He was the one that compressed gold and silver so much that they could fit two regions in. My theory is they were trying to do this from the start. They were trying to have two regions in the first place, hence the 190 Pokemon that when cut down became 151. So they obviously knew that they were going to have two regions, and obviously after that point they decided we'll ditch a certain amount of them. We're not going to finish it. We need to get the game released for 1996. So you can almost see that they were thinking about future generations before they even made the future generations. And that's an interesting thought, is that we've found out this new information with these screenshots. And we can obviously see that they were thinking about other generations or other Pokemon that were ditched. And I just think this is quite interesting how they've decided to include it in this story about Pocket Monsters and the origin of it without us knowing that these were a thing. You know, certain designs like this, you know, this torpedo shark thing, I love it. I think it's great. If that had become a Pokemon, it would be a brilliant Pokemon. Now, this brings me to the idea that will we, in the new games, be getting these Pokemon back? Or will they not bother? Will they just say, you know what, we're going to take our losses and just not bother with these forms? I don't really know. I don't think they'll actually bother with these forms particularly. I feel like the reason why they got rid of them is because they weren't as, you know, solidified as concepts. You know, they didn't make sense, so they decided to get rid of them sooner rather than later. But I just find it interesting that even still, from 2010, this guy was asking questions, and even now, today, and yesterday basically, this has just been proven that there were other forms, and it all links together into this big theory of, were they going to have 190 Pokemon? I think they definitely were intended to have 190 Pokemon, but obviously couldn't due to timings and that sort of thing. So that's all the time I have for this theory today, guys. If you enjoyed, be sure to smash that like button down below. Leave me a comment and let me know what you think of this theory and whether you think it's true or not. And be sure to subscribe and put the little bell on for notifications just so you know when I upload. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.